even if they don't immediately start increasing their arsenals, the mind games, the mindset changes when there are no guardrails, and over time you begin to think, and the treaty put limits on how many deployed strategic nuclear weapons they could have, and also the number of missiles and the number of launchers that they could have. So it was an Obama-era treaty, and actually it was the final one of a whole series of bilateral arms control agreements between Russia and the US. And it expired last month in February. China is really very much opposed to joining a trilateral or multilateral arms control negotiation. My feeling is that if any progress is to be made here, then actually Putin and Trump are absolutely key to this, because they are, particularly Trump, because his desire to do a deal, his desire to win the Nobel Peace Prize, his desire to, leave a legacy, is quite, it's quite attractive to this issue.
Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Simon Cleobury. Simon Cleobury was Deputy Ambassador Disarmament for the United Kingdom's government, for the British government of the United Kingdom in Northern Ireland. He is a leading global expert on non-proliferation. Currently, he's at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, and today he is our honored guest, and we will be discussing something exceedingly important. We will be discussing arms control needs a new start. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you, Atul. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Simon, for making the time. So, Simon, we are speaking at a time when everyone, or not everyone, but people in the disarmament world are talking about the expiration of the New START treaty. So let's kick off with a very simple question. What was the New START treaty?
Sure. So the New START treaty, or to give it its full name, the New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, that's where the START bit comes from, was a bilateral agreement between Russia and the United States to place limits on each other's strategic nuclear arsenals. So by strategic nuclear weapons, we mean the big ones, the ones that are intended to target your adversary's critical infrastructure and population centers. And the treaty put limits on how many deployed strategic nuclear weapons they could have, and also the number of missiles and the number of launchers that they could have. It was signed in 2010 and came into force the following year. I mentioned that because it's important to note that it was negotiated and agreed under the Obama administration. So it was an Obama-era treaty, and actually it was the final one of a whole series of bilateral arms control agreements between Russia and the US. And it expired last month in February, and that has got the arms control community debating what's going to come next, which is why this is a timely discussion to be had. I would say, given the global context at the moment, 4 or 5 weeks ago, when the treaty expired, feels like a long time ago, given all that's going on in the Middle East. But it is a very important moment in arms control, and very important to discuss what comes next.
So, what did the New START treaty achieve? And a follow-up question from that is, why was it important?
So I think there are two main elements to the treaty. I would say the first element is the limits that I just mentioned on the number of deployed strategic nuclear warheads the two sides could have, and the number of deployed missiles and launchers. And that was important for what we call strategic stability. So the kind of balance of power, if you like, between the two sides, and also in terms of the two sides being able to know what each other had in terms of deployed weapons and delivery systems. So those limits, those caps, had the effect of, in a sense, preventing an arms race and stopping the two sides from being caught in what you might call a never-ending security dilemma. So it served that very important strategic stability function. The second element of the treaty, which is, I think, where the the real value of it is, or was on the verification mechanisms that were built into the treaty, which I think are a very significant trust and confidence building measure. The verification regime, there are many provisions of this in the treaty, but basically it provided for data sharing, notifications, on-site inspections, and also regular bilateral consultations, which happened in Geneva, actually. And so this exchange of information and the monitoring of implementation can be seen as a really important risk reduction measure, because it meant that the two sides were talking to each other. It meant that the likelihood of misunderstandings about each other's capabilities were reduced, and it gave an element of predictability and certainty. And that's one of the, and we can come on to talk about this, but that's one of the big problems now, is that we've lost that predictability and certainty that a treaty like this can bring.
I see. So let's get into the weeds a little bit. Why did the treaty give the US, or the United States, and the Russian Federation 7 years to meet the limit on offensive arms? Why not more? Why not less?
I think the short or basic answer to that is that reducing your deployed weapons and launchers and missiles is not something that you can just do overnight, and it's something that costs a lot of money. I think taking missiles out of service and retiring launchers and bombers, making modifications to things like your submarines is something that is technical. It's time consuming. You need the manpower. You also need the resources. So I think that's one possible explanation. I think also it's something that, but given this is a strategic stability treaty, I think if you did reductions quite quickly, or if one side went quicker than the other, or one side wasn't able to monitor what the other side was doing, then I think that could have led to a strategic imbalance. And so I think they built in that time to make sure that that strategic balance was maintained, and that no instability in the deterrence relationship was created. They also would have wanted to build in time for proper monitoring and verification of whether the two sides had actually got to the limit set out in the treaty. And then I think a final reason is that seemed to be the number of years that was the kind of standard, because I think in previous arms control agreements between the two sides, they went for 7 years. So I think that just seems to be 7 was the magic number for this sort of thing.
The 7-year itch, huh?
Yeah.
Or the 7-year, the perfect 7, the lucky 7.
Yeah.
Why did both parties agree to extend the treaty by 5 years in 2021? Why not 10? Why not 15?
Well, that is because it was specifically envisioned by the negotiators at the time to have this potential 5-year extension. So it says 5 years in the treaty, so that's why it's not more or less than that. And also it was envisioned as a one-off. When it came to, in 2021, when it came to the expiry of the original term of the treaty, I think Presidents Biden and Putin agreed to extend it. By doing that, they were following the plan of the original negotiators. And I think if you look back, 2021 feels like a different world that we live in now. And I think at the time of the extension, I think it served both sides' interests to continue with the treaty. And so it made sense to agree to that extension. And I think, looking back to it at that time, I think the extension was, relatively speaking, straightforward to do. Of course, it was right at the start of Biden's term, so it was,
before the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yeah, so it was before the Russia-Ukraine war. It was after Trump's first presidency, and I mentioned that because. We can perhaps come on to this, is that Trump always saw this treaty as an Obama treaty. And so whether he was in power at the time that the extension could have been made. It's question mark as to whether he would have extended it for another 5 years. But Biden was in power, and he agreed to extend it, which is what the intention of the negotiators was.
So the treaty has expired. Mm-hmm. With the treaty expired, what happens to both countries' nuclear arms stockpiles? And are we now in a new arms race?
Well, with the expiry of the treaty, quite obviously there are now no longer any constraints on the size of the two countries' nuclear arsenals. This was the final treaty standing, final nuclear arms control treaty standing, and so there's now nothing. So there are no constraints. But that does not necessarily mean that we're automatically in a new arms race, because I think, as I was saying earlier, when we were talking about how the countries needed the time to get down to those limits, you also need time to upload and go in the other direction. So I don't think that is something that would necessarily happen immediately.
But the guardrails are off. Yeah. Let's be clear about that.
Indeed, the guardrails are off. And the important point here is actually that even if they don't immediately start increasing their arsenals, the mind games, the mindset changes when there are no guardrails, and over time you begin to think, perhaps they actually are increasing their deployed warheads, their deployed missiles, and that then starts to affect the military planning that you do. If you think that the other side is building up, but you don't know because there's no verification regime anymore, then you think to yourself, maybe we should expand our forces. So it adds to the uncertainty, the unpredictability, and it feeds into this perception or this idea that the security dilemma. If the other side is building up, then we need to too, and then that's what gets you into a potential arms race. So I'm not saying that we necessarily are in one at the moment because of. The treaty's only expired a few weeks, but I think there is very much the concern that over time. And again, we're going to come on probably to talk about what the prospects of a new agreement will be, and they're not very good. So over time, the perception then is that the arsenals might start expanding again, and then you're in potentially into arms race territory.
Well, the global situation today. Let's look at the Russia-Ukraine war. Let's look at US and Israel attacking Iran, and Iran then striking, amongst other places, the LNG, the liquefied natural gas facilities in Qatar, apart from so many other bases in the Gulf, is far more complicated than it was in 2011. That's when the treaty, I believe, began, didn't it? Negotiating in 2010 and kicks off in 2011, or am I mixing up my dates?
That's right. Yeah, it's signed in 2010 and came into force in 2011.
2011. Okay, yeah. So I've got my dates right. So would US and Russia today negotiate a new treaty at all?
Well, I think you're absolutely right to mention the very, very different global situation that we're in now than when the New START treaty was negotiated, and I think there's a really important point here about nuclear arms control in general and its relationship with geopolitics. I think previously, particularly in terms of bilateral discussions between the US and Russia, they were able to compartmentalize, in a sense, to talk about nuclear arms control issues without letting the other politics get in the way. I don't think you can do that now. I think the world is so much more complex. I think that the trust between the two countries is now very low, and I think we're in a totally different world in terms of being able to sit down and negotiate a successor treaty.
If I can stop you just a minute.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, in Washington, D.C., particularly amongst the Democrats, there is a very strong sentiment about Russia being a fundamentally irresponsible and aggressive power that violated the sovereignty of Ukraine.
Hmm.
They see Russia as very much a criminal actor in the international system that has broken the rules based order with
Yeah,
its invasion of Ukraine.
yeah.
In Russia, there is a very strong sentiment that the US is conducting a covert war against Russia by arming and aiding Ukraine. And the suspicion is particularly high when it comes to Democrats rather than Republicans, because obviously under US President Donald Trump, the US has shifted a wee bit on Ukraine. So
Hmm.
with this, you mentioned this low trust, and with this element which I'm adding of this suspicion and maybe even paranoia, where do we go?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a perfect storm on the US side because you mentioned the Democrats saying, "Why should we do a deal with Russia? We can't trust them. They go back. They violate treaties that they sign up to, and they breach international law." And then on the Republican side, they're much more cautious about arms control agreements anyway,
Yes,
historically. So if you put that together, then you have a US position that I think will be, really quite um, reluctant to enter into, reluctance probably not the right word, but very cautious about entering into a new agreement with a partner that they don't trust. But of course, the trust works both ways, and I think from the Russian perspective, they see U.S. support for Ukraine. Okay, that dynamic has changed under the Trump presidency, but they still see the US supporting Ukraine, and they don't trust them because of that. And also, they look at what else is going on in the world, and the current crisis in the Middle East is, I think, another example of why the Russians would not trust the US. So you have this complete lack of trust. Now, another reason why I think a successor agreement is going to be hard to come by anytime soon is that one, on the US side, they want what they call a new and better treaty, not only covering strategic nuclear weapons, but also tactical nuclear weapons and new capabilities that the Russians have, like hypersonic missiles. So they want it to cover. They want the scope of a new treaty to be broader, but even more importantly than that, they want it to be multilateralized. And so Trump has spoken
yes.
a lot in his first term, and also now in his second term, about the need for China to be at the table too. And
Funny,
so,
funny that
yeah.
after debunking and criticizing and damning multilateralism to want multilateralism here.
Well, I mean, I think we live we live in rather ironic and hypocritical times. But yes, exactly. Yeah, I mean, multilateral in the sense that he wants it to be trilateral, and
It
so if
wants
he
a
wants it.
ménage à trois, basically. Two
Yeah,
isn't
but
enough.
then the Russians want to bring it would then want to make it at five. They would want to bring in the French and the UK into the
Yeah,
discussions, which they would be, I think, cautious about. Although I personally think that they should agree to do that,
yeah.
because I think it would be a helpful move if they did. But but I think China is really very much opposed to joining a trilateral or multilateral arms control
We'll get
negotiation.
to
So
China in a bit. We'll get to
yeah,
China in a bit. Let
yeah,
me ask you a further question on US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. So the
yeah.
Trump Putin bromance is well known around the world. Both have made comments that or suggesting that they will honor the agreement for a while longer or negotiate a better one. Are they sincere, or is this just something to reassure people?
Yeah, I mean those comments were made in the run up to the expiry of the treaty last month. I suspect that they probably no longer stand, particularly from the US side. I think the offer from Putin, I think, was sincere. I think the problem the US had with it was that it was just to uphold the limits of the treaty, but it didn't say anything on the verification regime, and I think they didn't want to go down the route of that without having a means of verifying it. And then, as I was saying, I think they want, on the US side, they want a kind of bigger and better treaty covering more issues. So I think it looks unlikely at the moment. But if I may, Atul, pick up on your kind of your bromance comment, my feeling is that if any progress is to be made here, then actually Putin and Trump are absolutely key to this, because they are, particularly Trump, because his desire to do a deal, his desire to win the Nobel Peace Prize, his desire to leave a legacy is quite it's quite attractive to this issue, I think, because he has made comments about denuclearization. He has made comments about spending enormous amounts of money on these weapons, and that would lead me to suggest that perhaps he is interested in arms control, in doing a deal, and as unlikely as it feels at the moment, at a time of crisis and very poor relations, he is someone that could, I think, set the strategy there, and get the two arms control teams from US and Russia working. But what would be really important, I think, is for him to have an offer on the table. It's all very well saying, "Oh yes, let's have talks," but I think he needs to make a genuine offer about to get the Russians to the table. And well, I'll leave it just on the bilateral bit for the moment. But of course, there's then an even bigger question about what offer he could make to get the others to the table, particularly China.
All right, we will get to China in 1 second. Let's
Yeah.
France, since you're British.
Yeah.
As Sir Humphrey Appleby said, we need nuclear weapons. We don't need them for the Soviets. We need them for the French. They have it, so we should have it. Yes, Prime Minister, if you remember, which was a follow-on from Yes Minister, something I grew up on. I still watch it before I go to bed. Shows my age and shows I'm a fossil. Nevertheless, French President Emmanuel Macron has decided to increase France's nuclear stockpile. He also announced a new partnership with 7 non-nuclear European countries. France's nuclear deterrence will protect its closest allies. This is pretty major stuff, Simon.
Yeah,
what are its implications?
Yeah, it is pretty major stuff. Although I would say we're still trying to understand exactly what the announcement means. I mean, he did announce intention to increase the stockpile, and he also said that France would no longer be transparent about the number of warheads in its stockpile, which is quite significant. And just in terms of nuclear disarmament, arms control discussions, this was quite big, because it's quite a step back. It's kind of a step in the wrong direction in terms of
his Jupiter.
Yeah.
He has illusions and delusions of grandeur. The French president is a modern day Louis XIV. He's not just king; he's l'empereur. He's trying to be Napoleon III, I suppose.
The optics of this announcement, with the nuclear submarine behind him, has been very interesting. Designed to portray and project power, and I think the implications, as you ask, are that this is clearly going to make things even more complicated. I think in terms of arms control discussions, because that the French are going to react to this, seeing that it's targeted at them, and I think it will. It just feeds into the complexity around a successor arms control agreement. And will feed in also to this debate about whether France and the UK should be part of that future agreement or not. I think for Russia it will mean their calls will be strengthened for France to come to the table too.
So the Russians may get their wish. They may want the big five sitting, the big five of the UN Security Council sitting together in a multilateral revision to the New START treaty.
Well, we'll have to see about that. I mean, I think the big issue there is China.
Okay, let's move on to China. You've mentioned China many times. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's finally discuss China. So, what is China's position on nuclear arms control? What was China's position on the treaty whilst it was in existence? And how has China responded to the official end of the treaty?
So China's position on the treaty, I think, was supportive of the treaty as a strategic stability measure between the countries with the two biggest arsenals, and they certainly would have been supportive of the extension of it when it was extended 5 years ago. I think they've been relatively silent on the expiry of the treaty. I mean, I think their position will be that this is a bilateral matter between the US and Russia. They always emphasize that the biggest responsibility for discussions on nuclear arms control and disarmament lies with Russia and the US, because they have by far the biggest arsenals, and so that is their response when you put to them, well, why shouldn't China also be at the table to discuss this, because China is building up its nuclear arsenal, and their response is, well, our nuclear arsenal is nothing like as big as the US and the Russia's, and for that reason they're opposed to any trilateral talks. That also would quite likely be the French and the British response as well, saying that we've got much smaller arsenals. What can we actually achieve if we come to the table? It's the countries with the two biggest arsenals that need to talk about limits and reductions. And then my final point on China, if I may, Atul, is just to say that there's a very long history of arms control discussions between the US and the Soviet Union, and then latterly Russia. Lots of know-how, lots of historical knowledge of how to talk about these issues. There isn't that with China. You don't have that tradition of arms control discussions, and so I think it's very important to try and work out how to bring them to the table in a way that helps kind of build up that kind of know-how and understanding, particularly between the US and China on these issues, because I think that's one of the problems, because there's no kind of culture or tradition of having those types of discussion, and just saying to the Chinese, oh, you must join arms control discussions, I think needs to be handled a bit more in a bit more nuanced and sophisticated way, I think, to get them to the table.
Understood. So it is not as straight as clicking your fingers and having China on the table. Let's talk about Donald Trump trying to bring China into nuclear arms control talks in his last term. Obviously, Trump's attempts did not succeed. Do you think he might succeed this time around?
Well, that's what I was meaning. I remember the picture of the negotiation room in Trump's first term, where they set out places for the Americans and for the Russians and also for the Chinese, and they took a picture of it and said, China, where are you? I don't think that tactic, and obviously that tactic didn't work, and I don't, as I was saying a minute ago, I don't think that tactic is going to work again in his second term. So I don't think. I don't. I mean, I think he's got to come up with another way of trying to get them to the table. And the issue here really is okay. The US wants China to come to the table, but if it's a negotiation about arms control or limits, what do they want China? What do they want from China? Which is still, in terms of, if you're talking a numbers game, way below where the US and Russia are. If you brought them in, what would you be asking them to do? And I think that's where the US side and Russia too would need to think about what they're offering, what their offer is to get them to incentivize them to come to the table, in terms of limits or reductions. But that then becomes circular because, of course, to agree that they would be better off agreeing that between themselves bilaterally. So it's not straightforward. But I think they need to have a bit more developed, something a bit more sophisticated, other than just saying, "Oh, China should join the discussions."
All right. I must end with a question, and I ask because a number of publications have been worried about the end of nuclear arms control. We, of course, discussed the Financial Times piece, which was quite extensive, and this was a while ago, in February, seems like a year ago. And the article was, "A world without nuclear arms control begins this week." And in this brave new world, without nuclear arms control, what do you think? What is your assessment of the likelihood of future arms control dialogue?
It's the question everyone's asking. And yes, that was a very good piece in the FT on the issue. I mean, I think I agree with what was in the piece about. I mean, I don't think we're going to see nuclear arms control. We're certainly not going to see a nuclear arms control agreement anytime soon. The question is more, can we get any kind of dialogue going on the issues, either bilaterally between the US and Russia or amongst the nuclear five? As I've been arguing, I think the responsibility and the leadership has to come from the US and Russia, and I think in a strange kind of way, Trump is someone that could deliver that if he was able to focus on this. Something that President Putin proposed a number of years back was a P5 leaders summit. So there's something called the P5 process, which is whereby the nuclear weapon states under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty meet, or should be meeting regularly, to discuss their disarmament obligations. The idea of a leaders summit to kind of reboot or reset, or as you said at the beginning, Atul, to come up with a new start on arms control, I think would be quite valuable. I mean, it's obviously very hard to imagine a P5 leaders summit happening at the moment in the middle of the Ukraine conflict and the Middle East crisis. But if we could get to a point where they could actually meet and they put arms control, right high up on the agenda, then that could be a way of rebooting this and at least starting to have some dialogue on strategic stability and arms control.
Maybe that photo op could be on a nuclear submarine with President Jupiter, the host. President Jupiter, the host.
Well, I think many of the P5 leaders are very conscious of their image, so I think they would probably go for something like that. And I think optically, I mean, it's obviously very difficult politically right now to see, particularly French and British leaders meeting with Putin. But one thing I would say, when I was a disarmament diplomat, I found that the disarmament diplomats were very much kind of working with their hands tied behind their back, because decisions around reductions on nuclear weapons, decisions around arms control and disarmament are decisions made at the highest levels of government. They're made by the head of government. And without that political direction, that political will on this, I think we're in for a period quite a long period without any arms control agreements, which is of course got us all very worried. And I always say when we talk about disarmament is that yes, the security situation is very, very bad at the moment, and trust is very, very bad. But there is an argument to say that, okay, that's all very well and true, but why don't you talk about some disarmament or some arms control as a means of reducing tensions and trying to bring back some of that trust? And if you could get the leaders to set that direction, then I think the future would be more optimistic. I tried to end on an optimistic note there, Atul, amongst all this pessimism given the current crises.
The doom and gloom.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, Simon Cleobury, thank you very much for your time. It's been delightful to talk to you. We'll have you back. Those of you who've enjoyed this conversation, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, press the bell icon, and go and check out our website, fairobserver.com. Make sure you sign up for our newsletter. We have 3 free ones. And on that note, thank you for your time.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.